Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Baechler. We're just waiting for Karina to pop on. There we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to our session today. I'm the Director of Experiential Learning in our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and I also have the great privilege of being a senior instructor in our School of Public Admin that's in our Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. I am so pleased to welcome you today to Dalhousie University's Open Dialogue Live. It's a series of weekly conversations featuring Dalhousie experts focusing on current events. Today's question is a big one. What will the post-pandemic economy look like? There's a lot of uncertainty that surrounds this question. This week on Open Dialogue Live, Professors Lars Osberg and Rick Nason will explore the question through different lenses. So we'll start with some introductions. I'd like to welcome Dr. Osberg, a professor in the Department of Economics. Dr. Osberg will bring his insights on the need for a much stronger social safety net based on lessons learned already during the current pandemic. And our second speaker is Dr. Rick Nason, who's an associate professor of finance in the Rowe School of Business. Dr. Nason is going to offer some perspectives and some interesting possibilities about how the economy might function as COVID-19 recedes and a new normal begins. During the presentations, we encourage you, our viewers, to post your questions online. A little later in our program, we'll relay some of these questions to our presenters. So we'll get started right away, and I'll invite Dr. Lars Osberg to begin our episode. Again, he'll be looking at insights on the need for a stronger social safety net based on lessons that we've already learned during this pandemic. Dr. Osberg.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. When we have a title like what is the post-pandemic economy going to look like, it kind of has a long-run flavor to it. It makes us want to think about the economy in like 2025 or 2030. But before we get to like 2025 or 2030, we've got to get through next week, next month, and next year. The only route to the long run is through a series of short runs. So before we talk about the post-pandemic economy, we kind of have to appreciate what the pandemic has done to today's economy, because that impact and the reactions to that impact are going to shape the trajectory by which Canada evolves and by which essentially all countries around the world evolve. And the basic news there is that this is a shock of a magnitude and a speed and a synchronization around the world that is absolutely unprecedented. The International Monetary Fund talks about it being much worse than the recession of 2008 to 2009, which was itself the most serious recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Bank of England calls it the most severe contraction in like 300 years of British economic history. The Bank of Canada doesn't even try in its most recent report to forecast what the economy is going to be like in 6 months or a year, because there's so much uncertainty, and that uncertainty has an impact in itself, because that certainly has a big impact on investment and consumption behavior. And when we think about what it's done already, I mean, back in February, which now seems so long ago, the official unemployment rate was like 5.6% in Canada. Officially, the unemployment rate jumped in 2 months to 13% in the April numbers. That's an unprecedented increase in just 2 months. But it really kind of understates the issue, because normally speaking, people are only counted as unemployed if they actively went out and looked for work. It's not enough not to have a job and to want a job, but you have to actually actively look for work to be counted in the official unemployment rates. So, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you know there aren't a whole lot of jobs out there to find. So if you count as well the people who didn't have a job, had lost their job, worked recently and wanted work, but didn't actually look for work, the unemployment rate was 17.8% in April. That's a tripling of the unemployment rate in just 2 months. It's it's just mind-boggling. The numbers like this just have never been seen, and it's around the world. I mean, the airline industry, Halifax Airport is running at like 2% of capacity, but so American airports are running at like 5%. A 95% drop in utilization. That's amazing. And it's been very, very unequally experienced. People at the top of the income distribution making more than $40 an hour, who are usually salaried, often able to work from home, hardly any change in their working hours. Also, they're now working at home much more often. People making less than $15 an hour, half their earnings, half their work hours are just gone. So it's very unequal in its impact. And to think that it's going to be over anytime soon, that there's going to be some sort of bounce back in a year, is just, in my view, wishful thinking. It would be nice if it were true, but even if we reopen the economy, if we're going to stick with the distancing, that's equivalent to an enormous productivity loss, because you're just not using. Well, for example, take using capital as well. Just take, for example, restaurants. If you take out half the tables so that they can be distant from one another, that's taking out half the revenue stream of the restaurant. Most restaurants can't survive that, and that's true from one end to the other. So we're going to look at a lot of bankruptcies down as this materializes and over time. Business and don't come back. It takes a long time for this to work its way through the economy, and so it's a long-term thing that we're we can really think of it as measuring in years, not in months. All that implies that we're going to have to think of a whole new set of policies to deal not just with today, but with the short-run impacts, and those are going to affect the longer-run policy impact. So let me go out on a limb and make three kinds of predictions. One is that a major lesson of this pandemic is that not only do you need a good public health set of institutions to take care of that, to take care of the social and economic crisis that a pandemic produces. We know that viruses aren't going to stop mutating. There are going to be future pandemics down the road, and the lack of a social safety net is, as we sailed into this storm, unknowns to us, we didn't have a social safety net that was adequate in place. Things like unemployment insurance, which got renamed employment insurance back in the 90s, were cut to only less than 40% of the unemployed in Canada, even before this impact we were able to get MEI. So the need for a real social safety net is just become really obvious. And we've developed a whole bunch of social programs at warp speed to try and fill the gap in consumer purchasing power that had to be filled if the economy wasn't going to collapse totally. And so, for a long time, the idea of a universal basic income has been on the policy agenda, often advocated by a lot of people in the high-tech sector, but it was thought about as being a kind of a long-run issue that, when the robots make the robots that make all the stuff we need, who's going to provide the purchasing power? What's going to happen to the rest of us when it's an entirely robotized economy? With that long-term secular decline in the demand for labor, structural unemployment, a universal basic income was always thought to be coming on the agenda, but 5-10 years from now. COVID-19 has brought it on the agenda in warp speed with an immediacy that's just dramatic. And the people at the bottom of the income distribution who have suffered the most from their loss of working hours are going to be thinking about this as something we absolutely need going forward. So big changes coming in social policy, big changes coming also in tax policy, because we've had a massive productivity shock. There's been a lot of output that's just vaporized. Now, who's going to take the hit from this loss in total output? People at the middle and the bottom of the income distribution haven't seen their incomes go up over the last 35 years. Basically, it's kind of a stagnation, bit of a bump during the oil boom times, but that's gone. So I think we're going to definitely see an increases in taxation to pay for some of all this, and that's going to have to come from the top end of the income distribution, where those are the incomes that have risen most strongly over the last 35 years. And they're, I don't think we're going to see a lot of willingness from the people who have borne the brunt of COVID-19 to start ponying up in extra taxes after this is all over. So that's taxation and spending is one part of it, but another big item on the agenda for many people has been climate change. And there's a basic similarity between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, and that's the theme that we keep hearing from governments again and again. We're all in it together. We're all affected by climate change, and we're all affected by COVID-19. And these are problems that you cannot solve at the individual level, that have to be solved at a social level. Now, COVID-19 has come on with incredible speed. Climate change is kind of a slow burner issue. Instead of your house burning down like overnight, your house burns down slowly year by year, but it still has the same common impact. So I think part of the impact in climate change policy is going to come from the changes we've already observed. The working from home that reduces the need to commute and reduces the impact of greenhouse gases through commuting, the need for social distancing in the establishment of patios and bike that encroach on the road, or bike lanes that take over road space. So a little bit of an chipping away at the dominance of the car culture. But more important than that is the realization that we are really all in it together when it comes to things like COVID-19 or climate change, and that we have to get serious about the slow burner issues as well as the fast burner issues. So I think those are three big kinds of changes we can look forward to, but they're all going to be politically contentious as can be, because we've had an enormous shock to the economic system, and you can be sure as can be that that's going to have major political economy impacts as the politics of the issue starts to debate about just who is exactly going to take the hit from this major loss in economic output. So that's enough for now.
Thank you, Dr. Osberg, for that. Much appreciated. Very insightful. I will now ask Dr. Rick Nason to join us to share his insights about how the economy might function as COVID-19 recedes and what a new normal might look like. Rick?
Okay. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, listeners, for inviting me and for tuning in. I'm not an economist. I'm a finance person, a business person, a financial markets person. So I'm going to take a slightly different view of this than Dr. Osberg. And I'm going to start from a very different place. And this might seem weird, but hang with me for a minute or two, if you will. And I'm going to start by asking, have you ever seen a murmuration of starlings? Basically, the flock of starlings that they're all going this way, then they're going this way, then they shoot up, then they shoot down, and they soar through this. Basically, these starlings are exhibiting a property that we call emergence, and this emergence comes from complexity. And I think that complexity is a very valuable and important way to view the crisis and how things might evolve / emerge coming out of this situation. Now, we see similar patterns of emergence in a lot of other things. For example, the stock market is often given as a perfect example of a complex system. Likewise, climate change. Dr. Osberg mentioned climate change. Climate change, the science of that comes out of complexity, as indeed does the epidemiology of how the COVID virus spreads. So there's a lot of things that are tied up here. So complexity comes out of what we call systems thinking. So systems thinking is kind of a new paradigm that started in the natural and the physical sciences, in roughly the 60s and the early 70s, and lately has crept into both business thinking as well as economic thinking. In fact, there's a whole branch of economics called econophysics that is based upon this. And for our purposes, there are two main types of systems. There's complicated systems and there's complex systems. A complicated system is something that works by a known set of rules and laws. And things that are complicated are completely reproducible. So for example, if I lift up a pen and I let go of it, it falls. And it falls because of the law of gravity. The pen doesn't waver, it doesn't sometimes go this way or sometimes fall. It falls each and every time. And for those of you that remember your high school physics, it falls by 9.8 meters with the acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared. Bringing back that nightmare from high school physics to you. Now, a complex system is very different. A complex system doesn't work by rules or laws. Okay, a complex system doesn't have a leader to it, and furthermore, a complex system has zero predictability to it. We can see patterns, such as if you do a search for murmuration of starlings, you'll see that there are patterns to it. We see patterns in the stock market. We saw patterns in the Hong Kong protesters in 2019. We all watched the videos of how they congregate together. We saw patterns, but those patterns are completely unpredictable. And furthermore, they're not reproducible. So doing the exact same things does not give us the same outcome each time. And so I bring this up because complexity is driving the crisis, and it's going to drive how we come out of the crisis, in my opinion. Now, admittedly, parts of economics are complicated. In other words, and businesses, for that matter, they work by known rules of thumb, if nothing else. But a large part of running a business or of how the economy changes is complex. Now, the important thing is that in a complex system, our command and control way of thinking simply doesn't work. In fact, it leads to unintended consequences. Okay, so in order to manage and develop the economy again, coming out of this, we have to kind of rely upon two basic principles. Okay, the first is to recognize what part of our business or what part of the economy is complicated and what parts are complex. And for those that are complex, we have to adopt a very different mindset of think, manage, not solve. Now, this is very hard to do. We're more or less hardwired to think in terms of solution. There must be a solution, do something, fix it. But with a complex system, there are no great solutions. Now, in the book Getting to Maybe by Francis Wesley, Brenda Zimmerman, and Michael Patton, they give the interesting example of raising teenagers as a complex system. And so, what worked with your teenager at 10 o'clock in the morning produces a totally different reaction at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Teenagers are a complex system. If you go to the bookstore, there's lots of books on raising your toddlers. And increasingly, there's lots of books on dealing with your aging parents, but there's virtually no books on raising teenagers. Now, ironically and comically, there are lots of comic books, a series such as Zits, that are based upon the folly of trying to manage or solve your teenager. And this is kind of an example of complexity. So our economy has fundamentally changed over the last 50 years. The economy and our way of thinking about the economy was basically based upon making stuff. But the reality is our economy is now more about ideas, concepts, and services. So for example, does Microsoft make anything? Does Amazon make anything? What about Facebook? These are all some of our largest companies. In fact, Facebook is nothing but a complexity company. The like button on Facebook is based upon the principles of complexity. Okay, if you take away the like button on Facebook, Facebook basically disappears. Complexity comes about when you have agents, i.e. people who can interact, i.e. like or share a post, and can adapt. And so we go onto Facebook, we post something, we hope that we get likes, we hope that we get shares. And if something gets a like or a share, it gets reinforced and videos go viral, posts go viral. If it doesn't, we try something different. And that is complexity thinking in a nutshell. So one other very quick example about the power of the government and central banks to control the economy. Thinking back to 2008, Dr. Osberg was right. That was a pretty big crisis. And we had an economy that was more or less going along, and if we want to use the analogy of a fire, it was a pretty nice fire. And then late 2007 it hit. In 2008, we then had a smoldering fire. And what did the central banks do and the governments do is basically they poured gasoline on it. And according to the old economy of making things, when the central banks and the governments pour gasoline on the fire, you get a big whoosh, the fire goes up. But the reaction in 2008 was, So yes, the fire kept going, but it's basically smoldering and growing very, very slowly over basically the last 12 years. And so this is basically evidence that the central bankers and the governments, with their complicated thinking, have kind of lost their superpowers. So what does this have to do with the COVID crisis? Well, the COVID crisis is very, very different from every other economic crisis that we've had. The COVID crisis wasn't caused by a confluence of events. It was caused by someone saying, tomorrow the economy is going to stop. Okay, 2008 wasn't caused by saying the economy is going to stop. Okay, the Great Depression wasn't caused by leading politician getting up and saying the economy is going to stop. The second thing about this COVID crisis, and another property of complexity, is you get inflection points. Now, some people call these tipping points, but an inflection point is, think of a pyramid. Okay, so you have a ball at the top of the pyramid, and the ball could roll this way or the ball could roll this way. And I think that there's a whole series of these inflection points that right now are totally unpredictable which way the ball is going to roll, to the left or to the right. But there's a whole bunch of these inflection points that are going to be key in how the economy emerges from this crisis. So, there's a couple of obvious ones. That's like, our shopping habits totally changed. Are we ever going to go back to bricks and mortar, or do we like the point and click shopping? That was something that's been a while in going. What about our commuting? Some of us like not having to commute. We like the convenience of work from home. For others, we go the exact opposite way. We miss the companionship of our peers. There's one that I want to talk about kind of in closing here. And in my dealing with a lot of executives and white-collar workers, I thought it was very interesting that Dr. Osberg brought up that the white-collar workers have basically been unaffected. And that's very true at this stage. However, I think that one of the inflection points that we're coming to is that we've got what I sense is a huge imposter syndrome in the white-collar worker. So we've all worked with the coughing Charlie or the sneezy Susie who come to work, with the cough, with the cold, with the flu, but they're just so critical. They must be at work because the company will collapse if they're not there. Well, now they're stuck at home. And all of a sudden, they're realizing that their company isn't collapsing. Their company is going along fine without them. Guess what? The senior managers of the company are realizing, guess what? Our company's going along fine without them. So, this raises, in the short term, the blue-collar workers undoubtedly have been extremely hard hit, while the white-collar workers have more or less come through unscathed. I think that what we're going to see is perhaps a bit of a reversal of that process as we go on. Okay? Now, the final thing that I'm just going to, and actually the only prediction I'm going to make, because fundamentally complexity, if you believe in complexity like I do, it's fundamentally unpredictable. But the one solid prediction I am going to make is that the meme of unintended consequences, or something thereof, is actually going to be a very popular meme about 18 to 24 months from now, as we start to realize what our command and control thinking of a complicated economy is as we emerge from this. Anyhow, I'll stop there and hope that there's some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nason. I will just say, as a small note, I have seen the videos of the murmuring of starlings, and it's something else to have it kind of presented to me in a descriptive way over, over such a call. Thank you to both of you for providing your expertise and knowledge on this really timely topic. So folks, we are now kind of like the fun part of our event. And throughout the session, we've had viewers asking questions. And so we're going to take a few minutes now to ask them. They're coming up on the screen, and we have not yet completely figured out the best way to do this. So there'll be a little bit of organic transition here. So our first question, which everyone can see, how do you think the relationship between the US and China will change over the next few years, given what has taken place over this pandemic? Dr. Osberg, do you want to give that a go?
Sure. Now, I think the relationship between the U.S. and China, you can think of it as a part of it. That question can be thought of in a more general terms as well, as the whole issue of globalization and the interlinking of global value chains on the sort of just-in-time basis that we've observed up to now. I think there's an awful lot of rethinking of that model. We saw, for example, these crises in supplies of face masks, the necessities that we needed right away that were dependent on stuff that happened to factories in like Thailand or some parts of China or wherever, and a system which worked well in a productive sense for quite a while, but it turned out to be really susceptible to these shocks. Now, the global trading system was already under stress before COVID-19. I mean, President Trump came to power vowing to make America great again, and started trade wars with just about everybody, including Canada and Mexico for a while. So in the undermining of that architecture of global institutions and multilateral trade regimes bound by international law was really under stress, even in January, before COVID-19, and COVID-19 has really accelerated that process. Layered on top of that is the presumed is the desire of Trump to get himself reelected, and his perceived need to change the channel and find a villain in this play for people to blame, so that he can blame, if he can blame China for COVID-19, maybe he can ride that one back to the White House. So there's a big political imperative within the U.S. layered on top of the loss of U.S. dominance globally, as the U.S. was pretty much a global superpower back in the 90s and the early 2000s. Now China is really coming along there in many technological fields as well as in total GDP. So all those things combine to put a big strain on the global trading system. And in particular on a country like Canada, who depends so heavily on trade, and primarily on trade with the U.S., but certainly also with the rest of the world. So these are really choppy waters we're sailing into. And as we come out of the COVID-19 thing, I think we're going to see a massive localization tendency, a tendency to retreat from that globalization trend, which has kind of dominated since like about around 1980.
Thank you, Lars, very much. Rick, did you have thoughts you wanted to add to that?
Just two very quick things. Again, going back to the theme of inflection points, in terms of what happens with China vis-a-vis the West, it all depends upon November, the election, as Lars kind of alluded to. And I think it's interesting to note that both political parties in the States are actively using complexity marketing techniques to sway on the whole China issue. They're actively and openly doing that. The second thing is, as Lars alluded to, if we phrase this slightly different, is our relationship with China was based upon efficiency, and again, these complicated supply chains. And I think that this points out a very strict lesson that we need to develop much more robust and agile second and tertiary links to allow things to function and not be so hostage, essentially, to our efficient systems.
Lars, I saw you take a breath. Did you want to add something?
Well, I think I'm going to argue that it's not complexity theory that is driving the political marketing of either the Republicans or the Democrats in the States or around the world. It's
driving their marketing.
It's finished. Yeah. It's social psychologists and big data analysis. You've got an awful lot of data points driven off your Facebook likes. The little like button on your Facebook screen, that's an engineered item. People put a lot of thought into exactly how to place it so that they could maintain contact with people. And so this is a much analyzed issue by the social psychologists, as the Cambridge Analytica people really got sort of visible in this process. But the ability of big data analysis to figure out how to micro target political ads and present a little reality bubble to different individuals at different times, that's what's driving a lot of political marketing today. And it's not a chance process at all.
Gentlemen, I do see from our great organizers that I think there's a slew of questions. So I'm going to move us on to make sure we can get to a couple more of them. So a question here from Kalinda Brown. Tourism has been such a large driver of economic growth in Nova Scotia. How will that change post-COVID? And what issues should public policymakers consider around tourism and its potential in the future? Rick, do you want to go start with this one?
This is kind of a tough one. You can't mandate people to travel. I do believe that Nova Scotia has tremendous natural assets that, as we start to appreciate different types of things, that I think that the whole stay-at-home, social isolation, et cetera, the hazards, if you will, of living in large urban centers, they become natural attractions of people to Nova Scotia. In terms of specific policies, it's very hard to think of any specific policies that will change people's attitude towards travel in the short term.
Lars, any quick thoughts on that?
The little slogan at the bottom of the Nova Scotia license plates for a long time was Canada's Ocean Playground. I mean, tourism has been a huge economic sector for Nova Scotia, and we depend on the inflow of tourists from the rest of Canada, from the US, and to a significant degree from Europe as well. Now, there are two dimensions that we have to worry about in the immediate future. One is the barriers. Do we want them to come in? A particular exact issue here is we've got a ferry from the States to Yarmouth, which the provincial government is subsidizing. It's supposed to start running in July. Do we actually want a whole bunch of people coming in from the US, which may well be going through a second wave at that point in time? So the one issue is the barriers for them to come in. The other is their desire to come. And that's a global issue around the world because, there's not going to be an awful lot of anxiety for many people to get into a little tin can, which we call an airplane, and then breathe in everybody else's exhaust for a couple hours, and then get off at the other end. The distancing thing and the impact on travel and the desire to travel is going to last for quite a little bit of time, and that means that there are a whole bunch of jobs and incomes, particularly in rural Nova Scotia, that depend on a pretty short tourism season, which probably isn't going to happen this year, may not happen for a number of years. We're not alone in this. That's not a whole lot of comfort to know that the Europeans are very dependent on a tourism industry, just as Nova Scotia is. So this is another example of the ways in which COVID-19 really has a long-term depressing effect, indeed recessionary effect on aggregate economic activity. And we've got to think about other ways of stimulating the economy to make sure that it doesn't turn out to be disastrous.
Thanks, Lars. We'll just look for a question from our organizers. Here we go. From Curtis, who's sporting an MBA headshot, I believe there, if I was betting person. Question for Dr. Nason. How do you think your white-collar inflection point will play out? Will white-collar workers move towards a larger appreciation of work-life balance? Will large firms begin trimming their hierarchies where possible? Thanks, Curtis.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First off, I think that the white-collar worker has very much been moving towards a larger appreciation of work-life balance for quite a while. And I think the new generation of worker is actually something that the large corporations are having a very hard time figuring out how to get. We kind of have the dichotomy and the stereotype of the Silicon Valley with the pool tables and, the free happy hours, et cetera, and the 9 to 5, your grandfather's company playing out there. I think that what's happening is senior management are very much looking for the flexible worker, are looking for the creative worker. I think the age of the knowledge worker, the knowledge white-collar worker, is rapidly going the way of the dodo bird. And those who can be creative and think and practice intelligent risk-taking are going to trump those that know things, which actually requires us as a university to think very different about how we educate.
Yeah, absolutely. Lars, do you want to go with that, or should we invite another question up?
Well, I think there will be an impact of the lockdown and COVID-19 in general on attitudes and preferences. For one thing, there's going to be an increased degree of risk aversion. Once burned, twice shy is kind of the motto. The experience of a sudden economic change, which came totally out of the blue and sort of totally blew up your financial plans, may well mean that people do more precautionary savings, so they're not quite as exposed in the future. Whether the sequestering of people back home for a couple of months increases their desire to spend even more time at home, or perhaps a little less time at home, it's not so clear at this point in time. People miss the sociability of the office and that other sort of social circle that they're part of, as well as maybe resenting the commute occasionally. So I'm not so sure that there's going to be a very fundamental change in office culture, but I do think there's going to be a change in savings behavior.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. So another question, is there anything positive that we can take away from the current crisis, a silver lining, perhaps? This sounds like something we'd like to hear from both of you about. Rick, and then back over to Lars.
Actually, I think there's several silver linings. First off, and again, I truly believe in the inflection points. One really doesn't know. But I am hopeful that actually we start to appreciate being around other people. I think that a lot was lost by our communicating via text and phone, which of course is what a different generation tends to do. And our forced isolation actually makes us appreciate the mere fact of being in the same room with someone else. Secondly, I think in terms of business, and this is actually more direct for education, I think that this dichotomy between just knowing stuff, as we've all gone online with education, it's totally changed the dynamic. And I think that students are starting to see how very basic knowing is and how very important all the nuances are. And that is translating over into a business sense where even something like this, the communication is very, very, very different. And what's managed out of the communication is very, very different than if we're doing this in an auditorium with face-to-face live interaction.
Lars?
Well, we'll look for silver linings. It's a good way to stay cheerful. We don't want to think that these are big relative to the costs, because the costs have been huge. And now some of them we've already seen news items on it. The change in medical technology, the development of or the greater use of telemedicine. As a response to the distancing requirement, that's been a positive. If you want to look for a very short-term positive, the decline in greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen clear skies in all sorts of places that were bedeviled by totally swamped by air pollution up to now. We may have seen a chance to change our commuting patterns, to change our use of fossil fuels. And so, but the question over there is whether that lasts. I mean, it's a short-term thing to not drive as much, and that has had short-term impacts. But the stock of greenhouse of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to accumulate if we go back to the old commuting patterns. So, and another thing that the crisis has really focused our attention on is a bunch of social problems that have gotten swept under the rug. Extended care homes and the miserable level of care that people get there. The need for an adequate social safety net to cope with sudden shocks to people's income, and perhaps some acceleration of the need for a universal basic income that can perhaps help us in the transition into an economy more dominated by big data, artificial intelligence, and robotized methods of production. So that the whole issue of structural unemployment that is coming down the pike at us pretty fast.
Well, folks, I'm understanding that you are all asking a slew of excellent questions. So we're going to keep going for another couple of minutes, which is absolutely excellent. A question here from Breton. Since relaxations of COVID restrictions are more present in smaller communities rather than large city centers, will we see a shift in the economic power of these communities versus larger population dense areas? Lars, can we start with you?
Yeah, and that can be phrased even more broadly, in the sense that we've suddenly shifted to many more people working at home, not commuting, teleworking, and that those jobs can be done basically anywhere. They can, in rural Nova Scotia, as well as in downtown Halifax, or in many cases they're replacing the jobs that used to require people to go to office towers in Toronto or New York or whatever, wherever. So there is the possibility that COVID-19 will enable a greater dispersion of white collar office-based kind of jobs. And the relaxation of COVID restrictions in small towns up to now, I'd caution a little bit on that one because we're still at early days in the pandemic. And certainly COVID-19 had its major impact in New York first, partly because everything's so dense there. But the recent growth in caseload throughout the U.S. has been increasingly penetrating outside into the smaller, less populated counties in the U.S. So it really may be just a lag effect, and relaxing restrictions on movement in those smaller communities may be something that was just done just a little bit too early, because we haven't really. We saw the hit first in the big cities like New York. We're seeing it creeping in the smaller communities, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to hit there too.
Rick?
Yeah, actually, just a couple of quick things here. First off, I think that we've seen a shift towards professionals, mainly professionals, wanting to work in the smaller centers. So we see over the last 5 years a trend towards cities like Minneapolis and Austin, Texas being a primary example, all of a sudden becoming go-to places because of the lifestyle factors and because they are smaller centers. Having said that, New York is always going to be New York. But the one thing that the crisis is doing in this stay-at-home self-imposed experiment is it's actually, I believe, accelerating a lot of these trends, but also it's accelerating something that's been happening very slowly, and that is the offshoring of white-collar jobs. In my profession of banking and trading, that's been happening in trickles, whereby the white-collar jobs that traditionally our alumni would go to in Toronto or New York or Chicago are increasingly going to Bhopal and Belarus. That is going to accelerate because we've now done this experiment, and we see that these people, regardless of where they are, can do the job. And calling a spade, the white-collar manpower is a lot less expensive in Belarus or India or China.
Thanks to both of you. Are we going to do another question? Oh, yes, we are. Fantastic. So from Mel, how will the economies of countries in the global south, especially Latin American ones, will be impacted due to COVID-19 in the medium and long term? Lars, shall we start with you?
Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, differing in income levels, lagging in their hit from COVID-19, but catching up pretty rapidly. You see quite dramatic increases in caseload in places like Brazil and in today's news, Peru. So it's going to have a major impact, and the major difference in those places compared to Canada and Europe or the United States is the almost complete lack of a medical system that can cope with severe cases. So you're seeing already a massive spike in cases and a death rate among the vulnerable that they don't have the means to get rid of. So that hits older people more heavily. It hits people with pre-existing ailments more heavily, but it is going to have a big impact throughout the economy. Historically, pandemics like the Black Death in the Middle Ages have had an economic impact, partly because they kill people, but they don't kill capital stock. So that labor becomes scarcer relative to capital in those places. And so that produces massive social dislocations and periods of political instability and conflict. But it can also produce over time. The evidence from history is that over about 40 years of depressed economic activity, but within that, a shift in division of national income in favor of labor, so rising real wages.
Rick?
I really have nothing to add. Latin America is the only place in the world I've never been to, and have had very limited business dealings with them. So,
fair enough. Excellent. That lets us move another question right in. From Andrew, what are your thoughts regarding the housing market? How do you expect to see housing prices, supply and demand play out as we start opening up the economy across Canada, taking into consideration the job market impacts? Rick, is that one?
Sure, I'll take a punt at it, although I suspect Dr. Osberg will want to comment as well. My view is the housing market in Canada, actually North America, is undergoing a fundamental change as basically the baby boomers move off into retirement, and they plan for basically financing their retirement in large part by selling their McMansion and moving into a condo. And what we see is the price of McMansions in most parts of the states in particular are falling like a stone, and the price of condominiums are rising rapidly. And basically, all depends upon what the millennials want to do in terms of house purchasing. And it also relates back to the earlier question of this whole urban versus rural versus suburban versus large city versus small city. And I think that actually we are going to see some very real changes of trends there that dramatically affect the housing market and change. And the housing market policy in Canada will no longer be driven by what's happening in Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto solely, and will actually be more of a holistic across Canada housing strategy and housing market that develops.
The thing to remember, of course, about housing prices is location, location, location. Trends in the housing market are very different depending on which housing market you happen to be in. The Halifax housing market, or the Yarmouth housing market, or the Toronto and Vancouver housing market. We've seen a big increase a long-term increase in housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver. It's gone on for so long that a whole bunch of people in those urban markets may have gotten the idea that the house prices only go up; they never go down. So you can always get a capital gain when you sell. That's not true. There have been major corrections in housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver historically. And so I think perhaps what the questioner is trying to get at is, what's the chances that we're going to see that sort of correction in housing prices in major markets like Toronto or Vancouver, or to a lesser extent Montreal. It's interesting to think back a little to what were economists were worried about back in December. It's only a few months ago, but then the big worries at the Bank of Canada and generally was the increasing indebtedness of Canadian households, the rise to historic levels of the household debt to income ratio, and the vulnerability that creates to a downturn in economic activity. And if that were, and the worry was that we had a bubble in housing prices in some major markets in Canada, and that if income started to go down, then a whole bunch of people wouldn't be able to make their mortgage payments. Once they can't make their mortgage payments, they have to sell. Then once more houses come on the market, the bubble bursts, and then you get this major downturn in house prices, because the house prices have only been going up because they're always expected to keep on going up. So COVID-19 comes along and really hammers earned income, right? People sailed into this with a stock of debt accumulated from housing purchases over the last number of years. And now we were seeing a bunch of incomes drying up, which were the incomes that were going to pay the mortgage payments to support that mortgage debt that was acquired back in 3 and 4 and 5 years ago. So there is a real danger of a housing price correction in the major overheated markets such as Toronto and Vancouver. Places like Halifax, we didn't go up as much, so we don't have as far to fall. But there is a real danger of a housing price correction in the boom markets of Toronto, Vancouver, and to a lesser extent Montreal.
I should just say the richness of your answers is really, really compelling, and it's lending to an excellent discussion. So we really appreciate that. They have let me ask the last question, which I'm super excited about. So I'm actually wondering a little bit about the pandemic as a source of real and true disruption in certain industries. And I guess I'm wondering about whether it's your best guess or just your thoughts about which industries do you think are going to just redirect or change dramatically in the next year? Like, which ones do you see service delivery or product development just having massive and robust changes happen?
Do you want me to jump on that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. I think we've already mentioned the tourism sector, the air travel sector, as two sectors that are massively exposed and in which we've already observed. I mean, huge changes. I mean, to go to like 2% capacity utilization in the Halifax airport in the space of like 2 months. I mean, that is unbelievable. I mean, if you told people like 3 months ago that this was going to happen, that the 95% of air travel movements in the U.S. were going to be like wiped out, they were, what are you smoking? But that's a huge impact. And I don't think anybody in the airline industry sees that coming back anytime soon. So those sectors are really exposed. Following after that, we have a very large service sector that depends on face-to-face contact, which copes very poorly with the distancing, and that's the whole restaurant sector. That whole they're probably better off than the large concerts or the theater sector, which depend on the model of squeezing hundreds and maybe even thousands of people into a confined space so they can enjoy the theatrical or the musical production together. So those are all sectors that are going to be just hammered. And the whole reason people have had CDs and recorded music for a long time. That's not really a good substitute. If we wanted to substitute away and just use recorded music, we would have done so long ago. But so the concert industry, it really can't go replace that income, and neither really can the restaurant industry or the tourism industry.
Thanks, Lars. Rick, last word for you.
As a director for Camerata Singers, I strongly applaud that last point. Get out to a concert, folks. Actually, if we look back to 9/11, everyone said, "My God, the airline industry is going to disappear," and it disappeared for 2 weeks, and then basically came back to normal. I think that actually people are quite resilient. Economies are quite resilient, and I think that. Obviously, some things will change and there will be structural change. But actually, what I see is more of an acceleration of trends that have been occurring. I think probably the best answer to this, and it isn't about industries, but it's about people and/or industries, is a quote from the philosopher Eric Hoffer, who said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." And I think that the emphasis on learning versus knowing, on creativity versus textbook knowledge, I think is going to be one of the dramatic changes that industries will adapt to.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you to our audience. That's all the time we have for today. We were so fortunate to be able to go the extra 15 minutes. Thank you for staying with us. Dalhousie will continue to offer these Open Dialogue live events on a weekly basis. I encourage you to follow this Facebook page to stay updated on this engaging series. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Stay well and take care.
See you later.